How's it going, and welcome to No Fun Alloved's guide series on Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden, a 5th edition module. In today's video, we will be taking a look at Chapter 7, The Doom of... Before I actually start saying names, though, I must warn you that there will be spoilers, so players that somehow found their way here, do not watch this. But DMs that want to take a look at what there is going on here, stick around because we're going to be covering quite a lot. And here we are, the lost city of Ythryn, the Netherese city that fell, and whatever else you alluded it as throughout the entirety of this campaign. Your players, after trudging through everything, fighting all of the Duragar, going all the way to Oriel's abode, going all the way back across the frozen tundra, going all the way through the Caves of Hunger, they finally arrive here at basically the pearly white gates that are this necropolis. And my oh my, are they going to be in for a terrible time once they arrive. They are going to be finding a lot of crazy stuff here. There's going to be a ton of monsters that they can be going up against. There's going to be a ton of reinforcements that are going to come in and try and kill them all. And most important of all, they're going to find a whole bunch of magical items, which is going to make them insanely powerful. But at the same time, there's also going to be some magical items that can doom the world. And I'm specifically looking at 3 in particular: the Scroll of the Comet, the Scroll of the Tarrasque, and Iriolarthas' Staff of Power. While the Staff of Power itself isn't going to be the thing that ends the world, it's the fact that they're going to use that Staff of Power on something and unfortunately going to, reverse time and all that. But we'll be getting to all that stuff later. I can already tell this chapter is going to be at least 3 videos because there's going to be so much to cover. There's a ton of information on every single area. But what's really unfortunate about this is we get incredible detail about practically every single location here, and as you can tell by the numbers, there's quite a few. Unfortunately, we only get one map for any one of these locations. Thankfully, it is the main location, but as we'll be getting into, it's very likely that your players will be getting into combat into a lot of these places, and it's just unfortunate that we don't get any map at all. I know for a fact that people are already working hard on making maps for many of these locations, but as of the time of this current recording, there is not locations for all of them. So you will have to go ahead and find these maps on your own or go ahead and create these maps. That being said, not every location needs a combat map. Some of them you can just go ahead and run Theater of the Mind real quick. The proportions are pretty small, but if you have people that really need that combat map, then you're going to have to go ahead and get creative. For running this chapter, we get a decent amount of information here. The first off is the character advancement. It suggests that your characters be at least 9th level by the time they arrive in the city, and I wholeheartedly concur because if they are lower levels, then they are going to get dunked by many of the things floating around here. It also states that your characters gain a level once they reach Iriolarthas' study, and they also gain a level if they perform something incredible, such as destroying Iriolarthas the Lich, destroying all of Oriel's forms, or activating the obelisk in Area 21. All of these things are pretty much near the end of the campaign, and you will see that depending on the tempo of your game, your players are going to be leveling up relatively quickly, but that's kind of okay because this adventure is probably going to wrap up here. We get information on Iriolarthas the Demilich. This guy used to be a lich when this city was still floating around the place, but when the city crashed down, he was basically able to survive, he's already dead, but whatever. He was able to survive, and over the course of time, he was not able to feed his phylactery. And what that meant was that his body basically disappeared, and now he is simply a floating head, a demi-lich. It states here that Iriolarthas is just simply floating around the city, or he's in his study, and when he sees new arrivals, he automatically assumes that they are people that are coming to save him. He's going to go ahead and study these people, and he will eventually determine whether they are here to save him or not. Iriolarthas is not going to communicate with the party at all, but the thing is your party might get creative here and see a floating skull here and try and be, communicative and try and be defensive. Lo and behold, any group that sees an undead shoots an undead because demi-liches can auto-wipe a party on round 1. It's possible. So characters that see Iriolarthas just simply following them around can make a DC 13 insight check, and they will determine that the skull is clearly watching them to see how they interact with the city. If they are not Netherese people, which presumably they're not, unless you took one of my, secrets that is in the secrets down below. If they walk around the city not acting like they know what they're doing, Iriolarthas is going to know that they're not Netherese, and he's just going to go ahead and kill them all. But if the players catch on to this fact, then they might go ahead and start stiffening up and start acting like they own the place, in which case they'll be able to make their way around here and not get killed. This is going to require a DC 13 deception group check, and that is going to be the killer here, because if it's the group doing it, then unfortunately you're probably going to have some not deceptive people, and that could spell disaster. So I'll be going way deeper into Iriolarthas later on when I'm going to talk about all of the major villains here. But suffice to say, if you're running this purely as written, and you go ahead and roll up that your players encounter Iriolarthas, and they go to engage in combat, there is a very good chance that your group just dies. Because quite frankly, Demiliches are absolutely disgusting. If you want a way to present the fact that Iriolarthas is so disgusting, then at some point later on, while your players are traveling around this place, your players can go ahead and observe that hundreds of feet away, as your players are in a building somewhere, they see a group of people making their way into the city, and they see this floating skull float right next to them, and someone goes ahead and attacks the skull screams out, and then everyone just drops dead. You can definitely have that, and that will tell your players, oh yeah, you definitely don't want to mess with that floating skull. Next up, we have the Fall of Ythryn, and here is where we get the definitive information on what the city was doing in Icewind Dale, and the reason why it fell. The city was here because they were searching for relics of Ostroria, which is an ancient bygone empire that was filled with magic-wielding giants that waged wars against dragons. So that's like some Dark Souls lore right there, that's pretty cool. But eventually, they were able to find something. They got something really cool from the Sea of Moving Ice. They found a large spindle. They brought the spindle onto the city and were studying it. But unfortunately for them, they activated it, and it caused a magical EMP to surge out, and the city began to collapse. Many of the people died in the crash because they did not have time to react, but some people did survive, and they were able to make their way around and see what all happened. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why didn't they just go ahead and start teleporting out? Why didn't they start doing this and that? Well, it's because of that anti-magical effect. A lot of them simply couldn't do anything. They were all wizards, and when you have a wizard that doesn't have any magic, they're kind of worthless. So a lot of them started dying out due to the cold. They started searching around, couldn't find anything, and eventually over time, this place was overgrown with ice, and this city became lost to the world. Now, once again, this is really cool information that we get. Unfortunately, that's a lot of exposition dump that you won't be putting on your players unless they search for it and unless you reward them with it. I certainly think at some point you should totally have this told to them somehow that, oh yeah, this place crashed in the city and there was an anti-magic field up for 50 years, so all the wizards were just worthless, and eventually the ice overgrew this place, etc., etc. I think that's definitely something you should tell your players, but probably not for a while, probably not until later near the end of the campaign. Now on to the Necropolis of Ythryn. As your players walk up, go ahead and show them this map. While other places I have recommended that you don't show off the map immediately, it makes sense that they'll be able to see the entire area. This place is magically lit because of all of the magic that's surging around here. And also the place isn't that big. They can go ahead and look around, and especially if they hop into any one of the towers and go ahead and get an overview of what's going on here. So they'll be able to see what's going on and be able to size all this up. But what's really interesting is that they will be able to see that this city is not upright. They'll be able to see that it's almost at like a 45-degree angle, And so your players might think to themselves, oh, navigating this place might be hard. Well, it's not. As soon as anybody stands onto the city of Ythryn, an artificial gravity will go ahead and correct their posture. So that's really cool. You'll have people that as soon as they take a step, they'll start to cant, but because of the artificial gravity, it works just fine. And there's a lot of fun things you can play up with that, and I'll totally be getting into that stuff later. For denizens of the Necropolis, we get the following information. The Demilich Iriolarthas dwells in the central spire. Mages who survived Ythryn's fall but succumbed to the arcane blight, which we'll be getting to in a moment, are floating around here as Nothics. Immortal servants known as Magen tirelessly perform their duties or wait in silence for new orders. What are Magen? Magen are magical human-like beings that were created by wizards to basically do mundane tasks and perform services. These creatures are human-like in all regards, except for the fact that they have blue skin and they presumably live forever. Now, they look like humans, but they are in fact constructs for the purposes of casting spells, which is very important to know. And also the fact that when these creatures die, their body basically dissipates into a magical burst. Their blood is also listed as having a color and consistency of mercury, which is pretty cool. So, littered throughout the entirety of this city are a whole bunch of these Magen, and they're simply sitting around doing whatever they were tasked with. Majority of them are in fact just standing around guarding stuff and not going to interact with the party, but they will defend themselves, of course, and for the locations that they are specifically designed to defend, they will go ahead and defend. And lastly, for denizens of the Necropolis, we have deadly living spells guard a handful of locations in the city. So this is some fun stuff here. Located all around the city are multiple living spells, the most famous being Living Bigby's Hands. These spells are basically just spells that are, spells that you can potentially cast that are autonomous. They simply just stand around and do whatever they do. For the most part, they simply defend areas and will go ahead and attack anybody that trespasses on them. And now on to random encounters. It states here that at the end of every hour you roll for a random encounter, or after every time they thoroughly search a building. You simply roll a d100 and consult the table. And it's here where we see that there's a lot of stuff your players could be getting up to. And most important of all, this is definitely reminiscent of old school D&D in regards of how many encounters they can potentially get into in a single day. Because let's say your players get here and they are here for 12 hours. Well, in the course of that 12 hours, realistically, they would get into 6 encounters. And that's not including all of the pre-scripted encounters that they'll be getting into once they arrive at locations. They'll have 6 random encounters, and these things will be draining resources. So 1 through 50, no encounter at all. 51 through 55, a tomb tapper. And what is a tomb tapper? Well, a tomb tapper is this horrifying thing. Absolutely nightmare fuel here. It looks like a executioner, but has a strange gut maw. Pretty gross stuff. But what's also creepy about these things is that they're freaking huge. And by freaking huge, I mean huge. These things are pretty massive. They have a huge HP pool, and as you can see, they have a ton of damage. They are very likely to hit with their plus 10s. They have a big reach. So yeah, what are these things? They just look like big old stat blocks, but what actually are they? They are essentially constructs that were created to help combat everything that the Netherese Empire was going up against, but they also have a weird sense of preservation for magical items. So these constructs will simply be going around the place and trying to preserve all of the magical items that are going on around here. And if your players bump into them, they're presumably going to have at least one magical item on them, if not many more, throughout the entirety of this campaign. And the Tomb Tapper is going to try and kill your party and acquire all of those magical items. And what's nice about the rest of the random encounter table here is it states that, oh yeah, you go ahead and use 1d3 Spitting Mimics, or if Auriel has arrived to Ythryn, then you go ahead and do 1d3 Cold Light Walkers. And I really like the fact that the random encounters will be changing over time. Mind you, depending on how long your players are in the city of Ythryn, these random encounters could get real old real quick. So hopefully your players kind of, not necessarily speed run through this, but hopefully they don't have to be dealing with the same random encounters all the time. I'm fairly confident I'll be writing a supplement on all this stuff, adding more random encounters, adding more lore that your players can find, and much more. And the best way you can go ahead and find all of that information is in my Discord. So I have started up a Discord, and I'll be going ahead and discussing all things D&D and everything else in there. You can go ahead and check it out in the description down below. And in there, I'm going to be hosting some community events and talking about whatever. And I'll also be talking about my experiences throughout the entirety of this campaign, because me and my players certainly had a blast with it. For magical effects of the city, we can see that a continual flame spell illuminates all places around here, and that's just a really great way to not have to shoehorn in the fact that your players have to be carrying around torches all the time. Really great stuff. And it's here where we get the information on the fact that there is this gravity field that is keeping everybody down, and it extends 800 feet up into the air. And lastly, for magical effects, any humanoid that spends too much time in here is going to unfortunately contract Arcane Blight. What is Arcane Blight? If any humanoid spends 12 hours in the Necropolis, they must succeed on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw, or they will contract Arcane Blight. This magical disease transforms the humanoid into a Nothic, but not all at once, mind you, because that would just be kind of BS if you lost your person right then and there. No, this effect takes time. Now, as they fail these saves over time, they will begin to experience hallucinations and feelings of isolation and paranoia, as well as they will begin to gain clammy skin, hair loss, and myopia, nearsightedness. They gain the following flaw: I don't trust anyone, and this will obviously be huge because you're presumably playing a role-playing game where everyone came together at the table and they all trust each other, and if you have someone that doesn't trust everyone, that could be bad. Whenever a creature finishes a long rest, the infected humanoid must repeat the saving throw. On a success, they cause the DC for future saves to drop by 1d6, which is pretty significant. But here's the kicker, right? Do you tell your players all that's going on? I personally wouldn't. I would just go ahead and tell them whatever they feel right at that moment. Like if they fail, then they begin to have some hair loss and they start to feel paranoid and stuff. But I wouldn't tell them where it's leading to. I wouldn't tell them what their DC is. Heck, I wouldn't even have them be the one rolling the D6. I would go ahead and roll that myself and just keep a note of who has what DC. Now, over the course of however many saves it takes, your players need to succeed until finally the DC drops to 0, at which point they will finally no longer feel the ramifications of all of the arcane blight. However, if someone fails 3 times, then unfortunately for them, they will succumb to the arcane blight, transform into a Nothic, and be under the DM's control. Only a wish spell or divine intervention can undo this transformation. A greater restoration spell or similar magic ends the infection on the target, removing the flaw and all other symptoms, but this magic doesn't protect the target against further exposure. So obviously that's a pretty big deal, right? The fact that theoretically you can have a PC die because they failed 3 saves in a row. You know, depending on the kind of game that you're running, that could be totally in par with what's going on. You could be running a meat grinder where that's perfectly acceptable. But if you're running a game where you definitely care a bit more about the PCs and you don't want them to die just based off of, random chance of, 3 saves in a row, then I would go ahead and tone this down a bit. I would go ahead and say that maybe they get more and more crazy, they get more paranoid, they start looking more freaky. You could go ahead and describe how they're turning from Smeagol all the way to Gollum, right? You can have that fun interaction where over the course of time, they know that people are getting jacked up and they need to hurry up and get along with the quest because the longer they stay here, the more they're getting both physically and mentally jacked up. And of course, another very important thing to consider is this is not only affecting your players. If you have any NPCs in the party, they'll start getting infected as well. And, this really translates to if they have an ally with them, one of the Arcane Brotherhood members, whoever the frick else they have. All these people are going to start going crazy. And most important of all these people are not going to be trusting anymore. And that's significant. If you have a whole bunch of NPCs with you and they don't start to trust anyone, then you can go ahead and have those fun interactions where people are more standoffish, people aren't willing to help each other anymore, people are just going to go ahead and start scattering. And that will lead to a clown fiesta of people scattering all around and causing a great commotion. Now, as your players look around the city, they'll be able to see all these magnificent buildings, and they'll be probably expecting to delve into a couple of them. But of course, they're going to see this massive spire directly in the center, and they're probably going to think to go ahead and plunder that because presumably there's going to be some good stuff in there. But the problem is, you cannot get in there willy-nilly. There is a force field that protects the entire place, and no matter where you come from, whether you try to fly in there or you try and, teleport in there or whatever, there is a force field. And the only way to get inside is by performing the Rite of the Arcane Octid. Now, what is this Rite of the Arcane Octid? Well, there is a rite for every school of arcane magic. And as your players go ahead and look around the city, once they go to every single tower that represents a school of magic, they'll be able to discover the steps it takes in order to perform the ritual to go and break the barrier and make their way into the central tower. The 8 steps include: hold a wand crafted from the nether oak over your heart. 2. Summon a flame in your palm. 3. Speak a secret about yourself aloud. 4. Compel another to share a secret with you. 5. Quench the flame in ice. 6. Mask your appearance. 7. Draw a circle on the ground using the ashes of a corpse. And 8. Stand inside the circle and consume poison. Now, as written, this is something that every single person has to do in order to make their way inside. If only one person does it in the party, they'll be able to go through, but the rest of the people will still bounce up against an invisible barrier. Now, depending on how lenient you are, you can just go ahead and hand wave that and say only one person in the party has to perform this rite. Because, admittedly, some of these can be a little bit harder. Some of these spellcasters will be able to do no problem. Summoning a flame in the palm of your hand, that's easy if you have Firebolt or Control Flame or whatever. But if you aren't a spellcaster, then you're going to have to get creative with this. Another thing to consider is how time-consuming this portion will be. Because specifically step 3 and 4, speaking a secret about yourself aloud and compelling another to share a secret with you, this can take a long time if you have a larger group, and of course you have to sit there and be like, okay, I'll go ahead and tell my secret, you tell me yours, person C tells, person D tells, etc., etc. That could theoretically take a while, and maybe you don't want all that exposition, and maybe you don't really care all about that stuff. And of course, the other thing to consider is the fact that people may not trust each other anymore. If they're playing up their flaw that they've inherited here, then unfortunately, they may not decide to speak their secret aloud because they don't trust anyone around here. You're going to have to weigh how much of the roleplay you're going to allow here and how much the flaws are going to dictate how much they can divulge. And most important of all, how much this influences the entirety of the game, really. So if you have one of those role-playing groups, then this is going to be a great time. If you have one of those groups that loves to dive into what makes their characters tick and love exploring all of the other characters as well, it's going to be a great time. But once again, they're still combating against all these other factors, all their flaws, and maybe they're fighting, the clock here because they could be on a timer. There's a lot of things to consider. And lastly here, before we get into the places of the Lost City of Ythryn, we have Exploring the Ruins. It states here that as your players make their way inside, unless stated otherwise, they are traveling at a speed of 200 feet per 5 minutes. Which, as you can tell here by the scale, is a pretty decent size. They'll be able to go through all these building areas in a relatively decent time. Searching an unnumbered location like many parts of this city will take about 30 minutes and call for a random roll on the random encounter table, and as well as a roll on the Ythryn treasure table here, which you players could theoretically find some good stuff. They can find some awesome art pieces, they can find some jewelries, they can find a drift globe, they can find a frieze that depicts some Ythryn lore, and that's pretty fun. So a lot of great stuff your players can go ahead and pick up here, both monetarily wise and lore wise. And finally here we can go ahead and show off Ythryn lore. As your players explore around the city, they'll either interact with items and objects that reveal information about the city, or as denizens of this city will go ahead and share some of this information. It states that whenever you give a piece of this information, you should go ahead and not recite it again. But of course, with only 20 results, there is a very good possibility that they come across the same thing multiple times. And, unfortunately, that can get really old having to roll up some new stuff. So once again, I'm pretty sure I'll be making a supplement on all this stuff and adding a bit more Ythryn lore that you can go ahead and divulge to your players. Now, a lot of Ythryn lore that your players can go ahead and find around here is just fluff. It's just interesting stuff. But two things that really strike out to me, one of which is, by law, every mage was taught the prestidigitation cantrip and was obliged to keep the city clean, which is pretty hilarious, the fact that everyone's a janitor and everyone's cleaning themselves up. But two, the most important one is the fact that an ancient obelisk stands at the shadow of the spire of Iriolarthas. Using the obelisk and a staff of power, one can turn back time. If you tell your players this, they are going to immediately start swelling with ideas about what to do with time travel, about what there is possibly to do here, and they'll also probably be questioning why wasn't time reversed in the first place. There's a lot of things that can go on with that, and as we'll be getting to once we reach that obelisk, it doesn't matter what your players want to do. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to pan out how they want. Before I start diving into all of the locations here, I'm just going to go ahead and go over why are your players here? What is their motivations? Well, that entirely depends on how you've been selling this entire campaign. As I've recommended, I would go ahead and say that your players are searching for this place because they think that there is a magical artifact or something here that can go ahead and help them out and stop the everlasting winter, which is true. There are several items here which can and will help stop the everlasting winter, one of which, of course, is a Scroll of the Comet, which they can go ahead and use to try and blow up O'Real. There's the Scroll of the Tarrasque, which they can go ahead and just try and smack down on her head as well. There is the Staff of Power, which can go ahead and reverse time. And, of course, there is the Ythryn Mythalar. And the Ythryn Mythalar, this amazing object that's located right in the center of the entirety of the city here. This thing is huge, and it's still emanating with amazing magic to this day. What's really cool about this item is the fact that this item can be attuned by up to 8 people. That's really unique, having an item that a cabal of people would have to use, which makes sense, of course, the mages all share in power of the city. But as your players go ahead and try to attune themselves to it, if they haven't dealt with Iriolarthas, unfortunately for them, Iriolarthas is still attuned to this thing. And if they go ahead and try and maneuver this thing with not already destroying the Lich, then bad news bears, the thing's not going to work. But what did they get out of attuning to this item? Well, they can move this thing. They can just have this thing straight up fly all around. The second feature is that a magical item can have all of its charges restored in no time, which is awesome. But third and most important of all is that you can use the Ythryn Mythalar to cast the Control Weather spell without requiring any components, and this casting of the spell has a 50-mile radius. For the duration of the spell's casting time, you must be within 30 feet of the Ythryn Mythalar or the spell fails. So what this means is that your players can go ahead and drag this thing back all the way to the 10 towns, and they would be able to control the weather well within the span of all the 10 towns and make it so that it's no longer freezing to death. So this is huge. This is once again just another one of the ways which your players can go ahead and put a stop to the everlasting winter. But most important of all, O'Reilly knows that this thing has a chance of ending her everlasting winter. So she's going to go ahead and try and put a stop to that. For possibilities on ending this campaign, I will be making a separate video, and I know for a fact that one's going to be a long one because there are so many ways you can go ahead and handle this. But skies are the limit. So hopefully your players finally make their way here to the lost city of Ythryn and begin to plunder this place. Now, once again, depending on the nature of the campaign, are they going to go ahead and try and rush things, or are they going to go ahead and just clear all this place out? This place is pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. If you have players that want 100% this place, then they're going to be in for a great time. There's a lot of fun little puzzles, a lot of fun combats, a lot of fun roleplay potential, and just a ton of things to do here. Maybe if you don't want your players to be on a time-sensitive notion here, you go ahead and just scrap that whole Arcane Blight notion. Or you at least put it to, let's say, a 24-hour marker or 72-hour marker of when you have to make that Constitution saving throw. Make it so that they're not in fear of dying every single day, Also, something important to note about this chapter is, what do you do about all of the people that were following your players and making their way to the Necropolis? There's Drow that want to come here. There's the Arcane Brotherhood that wants to come here. There's potentially some ragged tribesmen that want to come here. There is a ton of people that want to make their way to the city and want to plunder it for all of its riches. So how do those reinforcements play out? Do they trickle in over time? Were they weakened because they combated a whole bunch of terrible things in the Caves of Hunger? What is going on here? Is this not only a race against time against the Arcane Blight, but also all of the treasure hunters that are following them? You can have a blast with that. There's a ton of ways you can go ahead and handle it. There's so many different aspects to this chapter, and it truly stands out in my mind as my most favorite chapter because there's so many aspects going into it. I cannot wait to start diving into every little location here because my oh my, is there a lot to go into. There's so many locations to this area, and they are all pretty well fleshed out. There is a lot of information going on here. In fact, if this was a campaign in and of itself, there would definitely be maps to every single location. But, this book was already big enough as is, over 300 chapters. It makes sense that they couldn't fit in all of these maps, sadly. But, the community is great here, and I know for a fact a lot of people are going to be putting in hard work making excellent maps for us to enjoy. But unfortunately, that is going to do it for me for this video. There is going to be so much content coming out of this thing. I cannot wait to see it. Thank you so very much for watching. And thank you to all my lovely patrons here. They are truly keeping me going and keeping me happy. All of you guys are keeping me happy. Doing this series has been an absolute blast, and I absolutely love it. Thank you all for your tremendous support. You guys are absolutely incredible. I cannot wait to get into future content here, both Rime of the Frostmaiden, all of the other modules that I'm going to be covering, and whatever else I decide to go into. You guys are really motivating me to do this stuff, and it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.